Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon we're going to be looking at another chess endgame, and this is pawn endgames, and to be more specific about key squares. Now, what exactly are key squares? Key squares are what we call those squares whose occupation by the king assures victory, regardless of whose turn it is to move. This basically means that whoever is able to occupy the squares are essentially going to be the winners, no matter whose side it is to move. So let's look at this specific example. We can see that it's white to move. And for this specific case, the way to easily identify what the key squares are is we basically have to take whatever file our pawn is on. Let's say this pawn is on the D file in this specific example. Basically, for white, it's going to be any square that are either adjacent files to that file on the 6th rank, and that 6th rank square on that very file itself, or if it's black to move, then if this position was set up with black being on d4 and black having a d5 pawn and white having a king on d2, then basically the key squares for black would be just c3, d3, and e3. And you have to know that in this specific case, the d5 square is not the key square. It's c6, d6, and e6. The side with the advantage that occupies those squares is going to win, and let's look at an example of this. Now, in this specific case, it's white to move. Now, it wouldn't matter if black was to move either. This would still be a winning position for white. And let's see how. White must play the move king to a6. And in this specific position, the key squares are going to be a6, b6, c6, and also it's going to be c7, b7, and a7. And that is because the pawn is actually on the 5th rank. And it's a bit of a different story when the pawn is on the 5th rank compared to when it is on the 4th rank. So let's look at this. After king to a6, where can black's king really move? Well, you have a couple of choices. You can play king to a8, king to c7, or king to c8. Let's first look at king to a8. If king to a8 is played, then white goes b6, king to b8, and b7. And basically now you're forced to move to king to c7, and then white goes king to a7, and you win as white. There's no way to stop the pawn from queening. Now, at the same time, you don't exactly have to play the move king to a8. You could also just go for king to c8, but this loses to king to a7, which is a very similar reason. And also, you cannot play the move king to c7 because of the exact same reason, just king to a7. And you have to be exact when it comes to this type of endgame where there's a b pawn. If it was another type of endgame, it wouldn't necessarily matter, but if it's a knight pawn, then you have to be a bit careful. And the reason I say this is because many people can mistakenly play this endgame with a draw leading in the end. So instead of playing king to a6, many people could mistakenly play the move king to c6. And I just want to say that if you are playing a position where there is a knight pawn, not a bishop pawn, not a center pawn, a knight pawn, and if you bring the king to the c file or the file that is not the corner file, then it is actually going to end up a draw if you continue this way. So what is black going to do? Well, if black plays king to c8, then you're just going to go b6 as white, and after king to b8, b7, and white's winning. So king c8 doesn't work. Let's try king to a8. Well, if this is played, then just king to c7, and now king to a7, b6 check, and if you stay king to a8, then just check, and it's easily checkmate from there. So the obvious move is force. You must play the move king to a7. But after king to a7 is played, here, this is where white must play the correct move. White has a choice of either playing the move king to c7 or b6 check. b6 check automatically draws the game. Why? Because king to a8 will be played by black. And now after king to c7, I did mention that yes, there is this key square as one of the occupied squares that you need to take in control if you are white, but in this specific case, because the pawn is on the 6th rank, it's a different story. Now it's stalemate, and this is a draw. So b6 check doesn't work. So what happens if you play the move king to c7? This is the only other move that works. And after king to c7, basically you cannot play b6 here because that is again stalemate. So you must play the move king to b6. And now after king to b8, king to a6, we've reached the same position right here, except it's just a couple of moves later. So the basic idea to keep in mind here is to play king to a6, and this is mainly if you have a knight pawn. You need to play king to a6, and now the basic process is easy. If the king sidesteps to the c file, then you just go to a7. And if the king goes to the a file and wants to put up a fight against the a7 square, then you now introduce the pawn to the picture. Now let's look at a couple more examples. So this is the next position we have. And we have to realize what we're given before we actually decide to make any moves. So we're given a position where there is a pawn on the 4th rank. Now, like I mentioned in the very first example, if there's a pawn on the 4th rank, the easy way you can figure out what the key squares are if you want to win is to play the pawn up 2 squares to the 6th rank, and then you basically include a knight's hop on one side and then the knight hop on the other side, and then you just include the square 2 ranks above. So these are the key squares that white is dealing with. So how does white get to those squares? Well, the shortest route to take is to play king to c2. And now you're seeing king b3, king a4, king b5, and then king b6, king c6, or king a6. You can obviously choose which square you want, but mainly these squares are determined by the placement of black's pieces as well. So black plays king to e7, white goes king to b3, king d6, and here many people should make sure that they don't fall for this trap where they go king c4. This automatically leads to a draw after king c6. And if you remember from my video I made about opposition, if the king is on the same rank or behind the pawn that it's trying to push, then it's an easy draw for the side that has the disadvantage. So king to a4 must be played. And here, king to c6 is one variation. King to c7 doesn't really help either because then you just go king to a5. And if king b7, then just king b5. And if king to c6, then king to a6. Either way, white manages to make progress, and black is completely hopeless. So, what does black do? Black goes king c6, white goes king a5, and the threat is to play king a6 and then follow up with advancing the pawn. Because now we realize that a6 is one of these 3 key squares. So, white is going to use this to his advantage. And unfortunately for black, black can prevent this king from utilizing the key square for the moment. But after king b5, the king is forced away from giving up either b6, a6, or c6, depending on exactly where you move with this king. So after this is completely winning. White would manage to get the opposition, and black is completely hopeless here. Now let's look at one more example where this has occurred. In this final position, we see that white and black both have one pawn. Black has a rook pawn, and white has a knight pawn. And this would be a bit of a difficult position to assess, but if we look at the distance that black's king is from his pawn, and if we compare it to white's, then we obviously see a way that white can actually utilize an advantage. And how is white going to do this? White is going to play the move king to f2. The basic idea behind king to f2 is obviously to play king g3, king h4, and capture the pawn, and essentially then there's an easy way of escorting this g2 pawn all the way to queen. So after king to f2 is played, we first have to look at what black can play. And before we look at king to f2, we also need to look at what else white could have done, which actually could have changed the entire dynamic of the game. If white had played king to g1 instead of playing king to f2, then black actually can save the pawn in enough time. And if you try analyzing this yourself, then you'll get the same result as the person who studied this very position, J. Moravich. So after king to g6, Moravich basically concluded that there's no way to win from here. So what do? You must play king to f2, first of all, but now when you try to approach the pawn and try to defend it, it's easier for white to win. Why? Because the king actually gets to g3 a step earlier. And that's because when you go to g1, you need to go to h2 and then to g3 to get to h4. But when you're on f2, going to g3 isn't really that hard, and now this is an easy win. So, that is why after king to f2, Moravich said that black must play the move h4. And after h4 is played, white can go about this in one of two ways. One way is winning, and the other way is completely drawn for white. And can you spot out which way wins and which way draws for white? Okay, so the actual winning move is to play the king back to g1. And it may seem like a crazy maneuver. Why do you just bring your king out to f2 and then back to g1? Well, you'll understand the reason when I show you what happens when you play the seemingly obvious move, king to f3. Now, after king to f3 is played, white is obviously trying to play the move king g4, capture on h4 with the king, and then keep a knight pawn, which can essentially help him win the game. So, what does black do? Black plays h3. And black is hoping that white will capture the pawn on h3, and now he can essentially get to the corner before white. And after king g8, this is a draw, because first of all, it's a rook pawn, and also because black managed to stay in these four squares, the vicinity is able to provide black with a draw. So, you cannot play the move g takes h3. Now, what about moving g4? And note that g3 is somewhat of a similar line. If you play g4, then black goes king d7, king g3, and black is actually going to sacrifice the h-pawn because it's a decoy. After king to e6, white, if the pawn was not there, would definitely have played king h4 and then found a way to win. But because the pawn on h3 exists, now white's attention is diverted to that pawn. So white must capture the h3 pawn, and black manages to prevent white from advancing any further. Therefore, black has found a way to draw the position. So king f3, which seems to be the more obvious of the two moves, is actually the drawing move. Instead, white has to take the long way out of this, king g1, and the reason why this works is now because black has managed to advance this pawn, now white can actually reach it a lot closer. If we looked at this position, we notice that the pawn is a step behind. But now, because it's on h4, this changes the complete dynamic of the outcome. After king g1, h3 is played by black, hoping that after g takes h3, we get the similar result, where king d7, and after just king to g2, king e6, king g3, king f6, h4, and now king g6, and you can essentially draw this game easily as black. You can analyze a bunch of other lines, but it basically leads to a draw for black. So that is why you cannot capture on h3. So what does white do? White must play the move g3. Why g3 and not g4? Well, we'll look at that in a second. Here, black will play the move king to d7. It doesn't help if you play h2 check because you're just activating the king either way. So king d7, king h2, king e6, king takes h3. And like I mentioned, it doesn't just have to be the fourth rank. It could also be the third rank. In this case, you need to go 2 squares up, and then a square to the left, and a square to the right. And after king to g6, king to g4, you'll notice that black has to give up the control of at least one of those squares. And now, white is easily going to be winning. So, what happens if you, instead of playing g3, go for g4? Well, this changes the outcome a bit. Because after king to d7, king to h2, king to e6, king takes h3, king to f6, king to h4, you'll notice that the key squares are g6, h6, and f6. So all of these three. But after king to g6, white cannot even obtain one of those squares. And like I've said before, if the king is on the same rank, or the rank behind a pawn in a king and pawn endgame, then the side with the advantage is actually going to draw the game. So unfortunately, this would be a draw for white, and that is why it's more important to play g3 here and take this way to win the game by using the key square idea. So that is all about pawn endgames and the key squares. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.